I want you to take religion with a grain of salt and see that the needs of the people must be met. Recently, it seems like a huge number of people have been asking what the role of religion should be in the modern day. Even many atheists are now entertaining the idea that despite not personally believing in God, there might still be an important place for religion in our societies. And I find this topic fascinating because you see the exact same debate play out in the 19th century among a huge number of philosophers. And perhaps the neatest example of this is in Arthur Schopenhauer's dialogue on religion. Here, the avowedly atheist philosopher considers the idea that even if God doesn't exist, a belief in him might still remain an enormous component of a fulfilling life for many people. In his essay, Schopenhauer depicts an argument between two atheists, with vastly different views about what the place of religion should be, and it anticipates many of the talking points that have become commonplace in modern religious dialogue. So this is a fantastic place to start to tackle this important question. Get ready to learn why religions may be allegorically true, how an atheist could learn to praise Jesus, and so much more. As always, bear in mind that this is not a complete guide to either this debate or Schopenhauer's philosophy. And also, because I am personally an agnostic very much leaning towards atheist, I will be approaching the question from that perspective. But first, to understand where Schopenhauer is coming from, we need some background on his philosophy. And here we must go on a flying tour through the wonderful world of pessimism. 1. Schopenhauer, a user's guide. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy is famously pessimistic, but there is often confusion about exactly what this means. Sometimes people just interpret it as meaning Schopenhauer's a bit grumpy, and there is some evidence that this was true. But his ideas stretch much, much deeper than this. Schopenhauer actually argued that human life was pretty unbearable, at least if we examine it properly and dispassionately. For Schopenhauer, each person has a will. That is, a part of them that desires things, sometimes completely irrationally. If our will does not achieve what it desires, then we will start to suffer. So if our will is directed towards food and we do not eat, then we will suffer from hunger. And if we do not drink, we will suffer from thirst, and so on. The trouble is that our will can generate desires practically infinitely. But it will not tell us this. It essentially deceives us with false promises. So it says that if we just buy that car or get that person to love us or sleep with lots of beautiful people, then we will finally be happy. That it will stop torturing us with this horrible feeling of lack. However, when we actually achieve this desire, there will only be a passing moment where we feel truly satisfied, before the will chooses a new goal, making the same false vow and promising to employ the same vicious instruments to our psyche if we do not comply. Ultimately, Schopenhauer thought that the aim of the will was to prolong our existence and to procreate. This is why he uses the term the will to life. This is also the first pillar of Schopenhauer's pessimism. He believes that our lives will probably never be satisfactory because we are constantly on a treadmill of misery that we cannot get off. Secondly, he thinks there is an important asymmetry between suffering and happiness. On the one hand, he thinks that suffering is a real, genuine, positive feeling. And this makes sense. If you chop my hand off, then I'm going to feel that in a really visceral way. I cannot deny that pain exists and that it is positively awful, at least subjectively. However, Schopenhauer basically thinks that what we call happiness is a negative state of relief brought on by the absence of suffering. So instead of joy being a positive state in its own right, it is rather like a temporary reprieve that we are often immensely grateful for, but one that is by its very nature fleeting and transient. The result of this is that happiness is strangely invisible to us. When we are happy, we often don't really notice it. After all, nothing is wrong and our wills are unimpeded, so what is there to take notice of? On the other hand, when we are in pain, that is immediately noticeable and totally undeniable. And for Schopenhauer, this is another unbearable truth about life. This asymmetry between suffering and happiness will mean that our lives are always characterized more by pain than by joy. The good times will fly by without us noticing, while the bad times will imprint themselves on our psyche like hot irons. One modern variant on this idea is the negativity bias, which is the tendency humans have to focus on the negative aspects of a situation rather than the enjoyable or positive sides. Which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If you miss a lion in the bushes, then you might die. But if you think that there's a lion in the bushes and it turns out it's not there, then ultimately you haven't lost very much. Thirdly, Schopenhauer argues that some of the characteristics we think of as defining our humanity fundamentally bring us suffering. A capacity that we humans have more than any other animal is self-reflection. But Schopenhauer thinks that this very ability compounds our pain. Think of how a small child or a dog roams about the world. They display this absolutely charming lack of self-consciousness. They just potter about, exploring, lost in the passage of their immediate experience. They are not reflecting, not judging, not predicting. And as a result, if they do suffer, it's only ever on one level. It is purely first-order pain. But us fully developed adults with our wonderful mental flexibility can not only suffer on this level, but can then also reflect on that suffering, getting angry or frustrated at it, or blaming ourselves for it, adding a further layer of pain to go on top. We can also judge perfectly ordinary experiences or characteristics as worthy of condemnation, and so summon a new suffering out of nothing like a morbid and masochistic magic trick. We can start to build our expectations for how things will go in the future, either getting our hopes up and then being inevitably disappointed by harsh reality, or adopting a hopeless position, spitting in the face of the world and making ourselves depressed by thinking nothing will ever go our way. Both of these can intensify our suffering, and they stem from this remarkable ability we have to reflect, think, consider, and predict. This is the very ability that made us the dominant species of the planet, and yet it can also turn our lives into a living hell. For Schopenhauer, this is yet another truth about life which is difficult to bear. Our minds are set up for our misery. These three beliefs make up the core of Schopenhauer's thesis that life itself is a kind of curse, and that if we look at these unsufferable truths head-on, it can cause us immense distress. And this does make sense. If he is correct in his assessment of existence, then recognizing these facts truly could drive a great many people to despair. They would get the feeling that life is completely and utterly not worth living, and may collapse as a result, without the idea that all of their pain and striving was worth something, that it meant something. Who could bother to carry on? If we are forced to accept that we are doomed to a life of suffering and that this will continue as we plod along in our meaningless lives all the way to the grave, surely a great many of us would just not bother to carry on. And for Schopenhauer, the unbearability of this view of reality is where religion comes in. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to either my channel or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. An existential necessity. If you watch this channel regularly, then chances are you are a fan of existential philosophy. You may spend your time thinking about it, considering how the concept of meaning functions in your life, and what philosophies help you best bear the suffering of the world. But a lot of people don't have the time or inclination to do this, and to be fair, who can blame them? Philosophy can be dry, confusing, and time-consuming, and it just doesn't strike a lot of people as particularly interesting. I'm not judging, there are plenty of things that I don't find interesting either. But then this raises a problem, because people who have no interest in existential philosophy still may have existential issues. They may become nihilistic, unmotivated, or feel like the juice of life is no longer worth the squeeze. And if they don't want to spend their time philosophizing, then it seems unfair to leave them with no answers to these problems. After all, they just want to move on with their lives without having to trawl through hundreds of pages of pretentious philosophy, and that's totally fair. And in this situation, religion is perfectly placed to bring some existential comfort. This is the first argument put forward by Demophiles, one of the characters in Schopenhauer's philosophical dialogue. Demophiles suggests that religion is both a means for people to make sense of the suffering in their lives, and also a way to shield them from having to face up to the abject horror that Schopenhauer thinks constitutes a genuine, unfiltered understanding of what our existence means. A theme running through a lot of Schopenhauer's philosophy is how we can cope with just how bad life can get. Given his general pessimism, this is understandable. And one way he thinks people do this is by adopting a metaphysics that turns our suffering into something we can still find both comprehensible and worthwhile. It's a bit like how if I was punched in the face, that would probably hurt. But if I was punched in the face because I was trying to save my mother, then that wouldn't lessen my immediate physical pain, but it would make it much more bearable because my suffering would have become meaningful. Funnily enough, this theme also comes up in a lot of prison literature, including including Boethius's famous The Consolation of Philosophy, and I've got a video on that if you want to check it out. The fact is, for a lot of people, religion is this organizing metaphysical idea that makes the trials and tribulations of life feel less crushing. This perhaps reaches its most extreme form in religious martyrs, those whose faith is so unbelievably strong that they are willing to die horrific deaths in its service. There are not many beliefs that allow people to endure being torn apart by lions, but religious faith is apparently one of them, and this is a testament to its practical existential value. And this would hold even if it turned out that the contents of these beliefs are, strictly speaking, false. And I do think Demophiles raises an important point that we atheists might want to consider. Even if there might be some people who have both the spare time and the interest to come up with existential solutions to their sense of lack and despair, is it fair that we inflict this burden upon everyone? After all, almost every single philosopher that talks about overcoming nihilism, from Nietzsche to Sartre to Camus, is adamant that it is really bloody hard, and that the existentialist project of finding meaning without God or metaphysics is something that will take a lot of work and perseverance. Is it fair to force people to confront these questions that they might never even get the time to sit down and answer? To make them walk around with a nagging sense of existential angst and only a long road ahead of them to maybe get rid of it if they're lucky? Isn't that just giving an arduous and unnecessary task to people who probably have enough to be dealing with as it is? Well, the other character in Schopenhauer's dialogue, Philalethes, questions both of the propositions put forward by Demophiles. First, he questions whether religious faith actually does improve people's lives. And secondly, he disputes whether this should even be a relevant factor in our decision-making. The first point they make is just empirical. Sure, religion may grant people a sense of meaning in their lives, but let's not pretend that this comes free of any additional baggage. While religious faith has granted people the ability to endure the unendurable, it has also caused wars, forms of oppression, persecution, witch hunts, and more. It is certainly a possibility that the world is better off with it than without it, but that's not immediately obvious. It requires further argumentation. And this argumentation is also tricky, because religious belief is so difficult to separate from other factors, so who knows whether it's causally efficacious here? Is it really that people are freed from their existential angst by a belief in God? Or is it rather that they mostly take value in their family, their hobbies, and their friends, and they might add God in there as an afterthought? Likewise, is it true that wars are caused by religious belief? Or is that just a thin veil placed over economic or political motivations? These are all open questions, and until they are answered, it is far from clear that religious belief is some great existential savior, or that it is some grand force for evil. The other part of his argument is pretty straightforward. He argues that it does not matter what the effects of a belief are, we should always promote what we think is true over what we think is false. And if it turns out that God does not exist, then we should believe this and not refrain from telling others about it. Philalethes does not really expand upon this point, but we could strengthen it further by saying, surely the commitment to truth is far more important than simple existential comforts. If we let this noble lie through the cracks, then what next? Are we going to start feeding people comforting illusions in other areas as well? Will we tell them that they live in the best of all possible worlds and they should just be eternally grateful for what they have? Should we alter our records to reflect whatever will make people happiest and present sanitized views of history, art, literature, and more out of fear of upsetting other people? Surely if there is one norm that we want to leave completely untampered with, it is believing what we think is true and disbelieving what we think is false. Remember, we are having this discussion under the assumption that atheism is true. If God actually does exist, I'm not sure that many people would argue against promoting a belief in him. And so the whole conversation becomes kind of moot. It is fascinating to see how this maps on to discussions about nihilism and religious belief today, with some proclaiming that the spread of non-belief in the wake of the new atheist movement has brought with it a sense of meaninglessness about life itself. Arguably, this general idea has been behind a lot of former new atheists either converting to Christianity or arguing for it in some societal way. But our discussion is not over yet, because now we move on to a classic philosophical chestnut and one of my favourite topics, the connection between morality and God. 3. The moral lessons of religion. Famously, C.S. Lewis argued that without religion, there is every chance that we will fall into a hopeless pit of moral relativism, where we will lack the ethical fibre to stand up for what is right and give in to our worst hedonistic influences. In Schopenhauer's dialogue, Demophiles does not go nearly this far. He doesn't seem to think that the end of religion will bring with it some sort of moral dark age, but he does still think that religion is a fantastic means of imparting certain moral messages, and that we should be wary of giving up this particular social tool. He sees part of the function of religion as communicating moral information from one generation to another via the use of stories. Take Jesus' parables, for example. They bring to life certain quite valuable lessons in a much more vivid way than simply stating them in plain English. The image of the Good Samaritan going out of his way to help someone from an enemy city, all in the name of brotherly love, is really quite moving. And it communicates the message that we should love one another despite national or cultural differences in a way that is both easy to remember and deeply compelling. Demophiles just thinks that this is a large part of what religious tales are. They are parables, meant to impart information in a way that is both memorable and promotes action. Demophiles holds a certain fear of what humans can do when untethered from particular moral ideas. And this makes sense. We Homo sapiens have committed all sorts of atrocities and crimes, premeditated cruelties and passionate violence. Certain moral and metaphysical principles can bind us together and help us to control ourselves. Images from Buddhism, like the Noble Eightfold Path, which encourages us to do no harm to others, or commands like Christ's one to love our neighbour as ourselves, can form important cultural touchstones, create shared social values, and, at best, make sure that we don't murder one another. We saw echoes of this idea in Richard Dawkins' recent interview with LBC, where he said that despite all of its faults, Christianity does have some important social and moral messages that we would do well to listen to, hence his identification as a cultural Christian. Of course, Philalethes points out that just as religion has been used to bring out the better parts of humanity, it has also encouraged some of our most depraved aspects. As he said in the previous section, religious faith has whipped people up into violent frenzies, encouraged invasions, wars, and persecution. Surely there is just as much an argument against the moral messages of religion as there is for it. Demophiles does not respond to this point in detail in Schopenhauer's dialogue, but it's worth noting that, in some ways, Philalethes has strengthened his position. If he's right, and religion has brought out both the best and worst in mankind, then that is an incredible sign of its motivational power. Surely, then, the best way forward is not to abandon religion entirely or leave religious belief up to chance, but rather to harness its power for the good of all. If religious stories and divine tales are powerful forces, then why leave them on the sidelines? Surely, if religion is this terrifying force, then that should encourage us to find out what set of religious beliefs are the ones that make us the most moral, and then propagating those as much as humanly possible. Of course, you may think that it is the faith-based nature of religious morality that makes it so dangerous, in which case this argument won't make a lot of sense. It may be that it is the belief in objective absolute morality itself that sometimes leads to us becoming despotic or authoritarian. But again, this is an open question and very much an empirical one. But of course, the other part of Philalethes' objection still needs answering. Even if religious belief was straightforwardly a social good, does that justify atheists essentially going on a mass deception campaign? Well, this is where the most exciting part of Schopenhauer's dialogue comes in, and where he introduces a fascinating way of thinking about truth. 4. Allegorical truth. Have you ever finished reading a novel or watching a play or some other work of fiction and yet still felt like you learnt something from it? You might put down a Dostoevsky book and really feel like you know more about how some people think. You might reach the end of a Shakespeare performance and discover something new about how people can interact or react in difficult circumstances. A story like All's Quiet on the Western Front might reveal a profound truth about the horrors of war, while 1984 might impress upon you just how important freedom is. There is a sense in which, despite being fiction, these tales contain deep truths within them that are worth listening to. Demophiles calls this sort of fact within fiction allegorical truth. And this is how he thinks religions are not straightforwardly lying to us, but rather imparting a true message within a false narrative. Interestingly, Schopenhauer seems to believe in a loose form of syncretism. He thinks that most major world religions are roughly getting at the same underlying ideas. And Demophiles argues it is these underlying ideas that are true, rather than the religion being true directly. An example might help to illustrate this. As we said at the beginning, a big theme in Schopenhauer's philosophy is that life is flawed and that people are deeply imperfect. We are prone to irrationality and tortured by our wills. But as we said earlier, to confront this fact head-on may be far too bleak. The Christian idea of the fall of man communicates this pessimistic message through a story, slightly softening it in the process. It lets us know that the world is going to make us suffer and that we are all deeply faulty beings, while embedding this in a metaphysical framework that helps us make sense of this fact. In recent times, a similar argument has been made by Jordan Peterson to support the value of religious tales. He argues that whether they are straightforwardly true or not, there are deep truths contained within them. And this is very similar to Schopenhauer's idea of allegorical truth. Similarly, Schopenhauer thinks that the ascetic practices undertaken by monastics in both Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and in Christianity speak to a further vital truth about life. For Schopenhauer, since the causes of human suffering are ultimately located within our wills, the only way to begin to escape suffering is to slowly learn to control and restrain those wills through some form of will denial. This is an extreme form of something many of us have probably been told at some point, that to be happy we must learn to stop grasping for more and be content with whatever we have. But Schopenhauer goes beyond this and argues that we should learn to want and will as little as humanly possible, in order to escape the endless sufferings of the world brought on by our discontentment. As a philosophy, this is quite similar to what some Theravada Buddhist scholars teach about becoming unattached to material objects and deconstructing our egoistic identities. It is also reflected in the Rule of Saint Benedict, where he instructs his monks to keep their own desires well under control and instead turn to God for their personal fulfillment. Sure, Schopenhauer may disagree with the underlying metaphysics, but he accords with the thrust of the message, that the will causes suffering and that asceticism is the way out of this. Essentially, Demophiles argues that religion allows people to see just enough of the truth about life, but without exposing them to its total unfettered insufferability, and that the truths it teaches are thus allegorical truths. Of course, this notion of an allegorical truth is incredibly controversial, and for good reason. How do we know when something is allegorically true but literally false? Telling whether something is literally true is difficult enough in a lot of cases. But in allegory, we have to take into account the way the story is told, the interpretation of the listener, and the context in which it is spoken. For instance, if you read Crime and Punishment and didn't pay attention to any of the underlying philosophical themes, your takeaway message might be, you can't get away with murder in St. Petersburg. This would completely miss the point of any valuable allegorical truth the story might reveal, and instead expose you to what is, literally at least, a falsehood. Likewise, certain theological doctrines like the prosperity gospel, or as my friend calls it, we're gonna need a bigger needle, twist the ascetic themes of Christianity and end up promising that earthly riches will come to the faithful and joy will spring forth as a result. Schopenhauer clearly does not think that this will be allegorically true. But there is a real question of where to draw the line, and also how we make sure that allegorical truths are being imparted, rather than allegorical falsehoods. My point is, there are a lot of moving parts to this idea, and we would need to iron out the details if we were going to use this in a grand proposal on the place of religion in society. On the flip side, I wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater either. However mysterious it may seem, the fact remains we can communicate really quite profound and true ideas through fiction and stories, and in some ways do so much more compellingly than in a propositional argument. In a lot of areas, you can learn both through non-fiction text, but also from really good literature. I might learn so much more about happiness, love, and joy by reading The Legends of the Buddha or The Brothers Karamazov than with a straightforward self-help book. I obviously can't give a complete account of all of the pros and cons of allegorical truth here, but I'm very interested to know what you think. So please do leave a comment down below. Philalethes also has a response to this. He argues that if religious tales are allegories, then we should not teach them literally, but instead as just that, fables which contain important messages. But Demophiles responds by saying that while religions are only allegorically true, it is the belief in their literal truth that keeps them so motivating and comforting, much more so than any fictional story. In effect, Demophiles is now outright stating that the literal interpretation of religions is a form of noble lie. They may only be stories, but it is the belief that these stories actually happened that makes them more persuasive and compelling than anything that openly proclaims to be fiction. And this is the other part of Demophiles' argument that can be difficult to swallow. Sure, he might say that religions are often allegorically true, but if, as atheists, we teach them as literally true, that still sounds like a lie. It might be a lie for the greater good, or a comforting lie, or a lie that hints at some deeper fact about reality and life. But if we are not ourselves literally religious, then it is still a lie at the first order level. So, here is an interesting question to close out the video. Let's say, for the sake of arguments, that everything Demophiles says is 100% correct. Religious belief actually is a huge help for a lot of people existentially. It can be immensely valuable for moral virtue and social cohesion, and it also communicates deep truths that people would otherwise be barred from discovering. Does this mean that atheists like myself should say things that we truly believe are false to serve the greater good? But however you answer this question, Schopenhauer's dialogue is well worth a read. It seems that many atheists today are asking the question, so if God doesn't exist, now what? And this is a fantastic essay to get your intellectual juices flowing. And who knows, maybe it will convince you to say that you believe in God, even if you don't. But if you want to explore this connection between religion, morality, and social cohesion in more detail, then click here for a full video where I do just that. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.